The dining room of the Celestine felt like a different city at night, one where every surface knew its worth. Low light found the glass, the brass, the linen. Servers moved like a choreography practiced down to their breath. At a corner table beneath a hush of private chandeliers, Richard Chun sat like the center of gravity. Expensive watch, tailored jacket, the kind of presence that made the room lean in without asking. Maya Williams was at the far end of a section, balancing a tray with 2 bottles of mineral water. She had learned over years of service how to make herself invisible when necessary. A polite smile, a light step, eyes that read a room and kept to the margins. Tonight she wore her uniform the way armor fits, worn, practical, and beneath it a determination that had nothing to do with the fold of her apron. Her grandmother depended on the hours she brought home. Richard spoke first, not to her face but at her as if she were a prop set on a Hollywood stage. He did it in Mandarin. His voice was low, perfectly controlled. He expected incomprehension to be part of his power. He said in Mandarin, "Kneel." Translation provided for the audience. That single word landed in the air like a thrown gauntlet. A few heads turned curious. Most did not fully register the cadence of the language and assumed it was a social joke, a commanding tone in a room where millions were spent on being noticed. Maya froze, hands steady, back straight, an internal clock flipping through choices too quickly to be catalogued. She heard the laughter, the polite coughs from neighboring tables. Glass chimed as a server somewhere dropped a tray, each tiny collision magnifying the moment. The sound of phones beginning to lift felt like the room collecting witnesses. She could have knelt. It would have been the easiest choice in the world. Bend for a man who had never been told no, collect the tips, hold on to the night shift that paid the monthly care for her grandmother Josephine. Kneeling would have been silence preserved, the daily compromise turned private. Instead, she did nothing immediate at all. She listened. She recognized the insult concealed in the tone, a dismissal more than a command, because she knew the language. Not only did she understand, she had once translated for diplomats in Beijing. She had left that world by choice the winter her grandmother's memory began to slip, trading secure work for the uncertain but attentive care Josephine needed. The job at the Celestine paid the bills. It did not pay for pride. Not easily. In the paused beat that followed, the camera of the room, phones held up like small moons, found her face. The room, conditioned by wealth to accept hierarchy, had assumed she would do the small humiliations that kept service smooth. Few realized how mistaken that assumption could be. If you've ever been underestimated, keep watching. A hush widened into an awkward ripple. Richard continued, again in Mandarin, his words softer but sharper, as if coaxing obedience. He said in Mandarin, "You, the one serving us, lower your head, show your place." Translation. A cluster of thin laughter, the kind that tries to sound casual, came from his table. The servers nearby averted their gazes, trained by experience to make themselves small for the sake of the bill at the end of the night. Maya's jaw set. She continued her route to the next table, hands faithful to the chore. But the words lodged in a part of her that had once given voice to the most sensitive conversations between governments. Memory is slippery, but language is a kind of tether. She kept the insult folded inside her like a stone, and when she stepped away, she carried it into a kitchen clouded with steam and the smell of butter. The kitchen of the Celestine was all fluorescent and heat. No artful lighting there, just efficient brightness that made faces honest. Diane, who'd been working behind the bar longer than most of the staff had lived in the city, watched Maya come in with an expression halfway between worry and resignation. Kevin hovered near the prep counter, a rookie with the respectful distance that fresh employees adopt. Gerald Bennett, the manager, wiped his hands on his apron and exhaled like someone who smelled trouble before it arrived. Gerald's first words landed like an order, not a question. "What happened out there?" he asked. His priority was simple: keep paying customers happy, avoid anything that could bleed to the bottom line. Maya described the command in Mandarin, a phrase-for-phrase rendering but stripped of the Mandarin itself. She did not shout, she did not cry. She did not need to. Her clarity made the tension in the room swell. Diane's voice was small but fierce. "You don't have to." She does, Gerald interrupted. His eyes were pragmatic. We can't lose a table like his. Techfear's party is one thing we can't afford to spook. You apologize, end of story. Apologize for what? Maya asked, and there was no tremor in that question. For being told to kneel? Gerald's answer was immediate and trained. For the disruption, for anything. We smooth it over, we keep the check, nobody gets involved, we pay the bills. It was in that exchange, silent between the words, that the stakes hardened into numbers. Gerald named it softly. What the restaurant could not do without. A private suite, booked for the evening by Techfear, for a prominent meeting. An unnamed catering partnership on the line. The way a lost table rippled into cautious cancellations. The manager's job was to keep the machine oiled, and machines in gentlemen's quarters are lubricated by deference. Maya listened while Diane put a hand on her shoulder, not in supplication, but in solidarity. You can take a minute, Diane said. You can go out, bow, say I'm sorry. Nobody will blame you for keeping your job. Maya thought of Josephine's face in the morning light, the way the old woman sometimes reached for a name that would not come. Each month was a negotiation. Rent, medication, a caregiver shift when work demanded extra hours. The arithmetic of love and duty had driven Maya to resign from a career that would have given her status and safety. Caregiving demanded an economy that did not reward expertise. She found herself telling Gerald the truth in small, measured pieces, about the State Department work, about the resignation, about the bills. She did not ask for pity. She laid out facts so that Gerald could weigh options. He weighed them, and then made the predictable choice. Keep the table, keep his job, keep the restaurant's reputation. Apologize, he said again, louder now. Make it right. This, the kitchen thought, would be the end of the story. Maya would return, bow, and maintain the fragile order. That was how the world at the Celestine usually preferred things to be, polite deference in exchange for safety. But there are moments when risk and dignity meet, and something in a person decides the balance has been mismeasured. She dried her hands and walked back into the dining room, like a person stepping into a courtroom. The noise shifted subtly, silverware, voices, the soft radio of the chef's announcements. Phones lifted higher. The cameras of the private club twitched. Staff who had learned the ritual of worry watched her approach. At Richard Chun's table he smiled with the calm entitlement of a man who believed his social standing immunized him from reproach. She doesn't speak our language, he said flippant in English, half for his companions, half for the joke of it. He expected laughter, not confrontation. He expected flattery. He did not expect a woman who could place him without flinching. Maya stopped between tables, the space suddenly enormous. She did not kneel. She did not lower her eyes. When she spoke, she chose each word like someone placing notes on a staff. Deliberately, and with an ear for the effect, she addressed him in Mandarin. Her voice was calm, resonant, the cadence of someone who had once been paid to choose the precise word when lives and strategies hung on translation. The room, which did not know the language fully, felt the shift as a current. She said in Mandarin, "I heard you. You told me to kneel." Translation. The murmuring began to thread through the room. Phones recorded closer now, faces leaning in for context. Richard's smile flickered, bewildered at first. A man confronting the improbable chance that his insult had not landed in emptiness. He asked in English what she had said. The question was an invitation to explain away power imbalances, a request for a translation that would let him retreat. Maya continued in Mandarin, translating for the room as she spoke, not loudly but clearly. She said in Mandarin, "You called me less than any of you. You told me my place is on the floor. Do you think money buys the right to humiliate?" Translation. There was a sound in the room then, something like intake but collective, an audible recalibration of how the figures in the room sat against each other. The cameras kept rolling. People typed notes, names, fingers already composing the frame for social feeds. Richard laughed it off, windmilling for charm, and then, assuming the language barrier bound her as it had bound other service staff in his orbit, he leaned forward and spoke in Mandarin about something else. about his company's triumphs and about rivals who failed to meet environmental standards. He used the language like a shield, the way some men use money to deflect human costing. He said in Mandarin, "We don't have time for those who slow us down. People who cannot keep up cause us costs." Translation? Maya's response unfolded tighter, a measured unspooling rather than a shout. She named what she had learned in the corridors of power, what hearsay and internal memos had suggested, the story that had been passed in hushed tones from employee to employee, whispers that Tekfir had been careful in how it reported emissions, that numbers had been massaged to meet targets, that engineers had complained and been reshuffled. She called them allegations, but she called them in public. In Mandarin, she said, "There are allegations that your company has altered emissions reports. People in the engineering teams have been silenced. Investors who thought they were buying green are not getting what they paid for." The air pinched. Technically, she had no access to inside documents. She did not claim to. She spoke what people in the industry were saying loudly enough that a room like this could not claim plausible deniability. "Mrs. Wei is here tonight," she added, voice steady. She should know what is being done in her name. The name reached the table where Mrs. Wei sat. She had been a quiet presence, a woman whose reputation as a decisive investor had become part of the city's business shorthand. Tonight she was not arriving on a chauffeur's wave. Someone had escorted her in with a familiar nod. There are power dynamics older than wealth, stories of ascent, of people who had once been near the counters and had, by something like providence and grit, found a larger place. Mrs. Wei's face did not show surprise. It showed interest. Phones multiplied, the recording a geometric spread. Strangers leaned on strangers' chairs to hear translations. The room that had once tolerated the small cruelty now focused on the exposed center. Richard's hands tightened around the stem of his glass. He favored silence at first, then tried to reroute the narrative with charm and dismissal. "She's being dramatic," he said in English, as if that could dissolve an accusation voiced in a language he had thought excluded her. Maya tilted her head. "I learned Mandarin to do a job," she said, and the sentence contained no accusation of genius and no plea. "I left that job to care for my grandmother. She has Alzheimer's. I work nights to make sure she gets the care she needs." There was a softness in that admission, the human arithmetic of sacrifice. It reframed the scene not as a performance but as a ledger. The audience had to decide where to allocate its judgment. Sympathy moved like a tide. Before Richard could fabricate a line that would swap culpability, Mrs. Wei rose. Her movement was quiet but decisive. The entire room seemed to tilt toward her as if gravity recognized the weight of a person who had made her own way. She addressed Richard directly, in English, her voice steady and unsentimental. "I remember washing dishes in a place not unlike this," she said. "I know what it's like to take orders and keep your head down. I also know what it is to invest and demand integrity, especially when that investment uses the word green and the promise of a cleaner future." Her words landed like a verdict of principle rather than hostility. She turned to the manager, Gerald, and spoke with the kind of authority that comes from combining personal history with financial leverage. "I will not be associated with a spectacle of humiliation. I can't, and I won't, stand behind investments that may be built on misrepresentation." There was a hush so complete you could hear the cooling wine. Richard's posture shifted. The aura of immunity began to flake. He demanded, in a voice that tightened, what Mrs. Wei meant. She replied, she would not sign the next round of Tekfir funding as things stood, and she would have her office review the allegations brought to light. She spoke of audits, of conversations with her legal counsel, of the reputational risk a portfolio cannot afford. "I want answers," she said plainly. "This conversation will not end tonight." It is one thing to be rebuked by a stranger. It is another to be rebuked by someone whose capital can deliver outcomes. The two intersected across the table between them like tectonic plates shifting. Phones erupted into connective surge. The viral machine of public shaming and accountability pressed its starter. Within hours, the video would be everywhere, snippets and full takes, commentators offering interpretations, the city's business channels repeating the same stunned chorus. The name TechFear trended, then trended harder. Calls to the company's PR line flooded briefings. Journalists began to ask questions that had been whispered for months. Engineers' claims, emissions numbers, internal memos. Richard's demeanor changed from confident to flustered, and a man accustomed to buying influence found fewer buyers than he had expected. He attempted to leave the table, but the room offered small obstacles. Servers moving with the sudden choreography of people protecting a human story rather than serving plates. He rose, muttered something about a misunderstanding, and left with the same abruptness of someone whose script had been overturned. There was no violent scene, no exploded fist. The scene's force lay not in physicality, but in the reversal of power. A billionaire's cachet failing to purchase erasure. For those who recorded it, the footage became a narrative of its own. A woman who refused to be invisible, a man whose assumptions had betrayed him. The applause that came was not instantaneous. It arrived slowly, the way a room grants recognition after measuring risk. Then it swelled. People who had been complicit through silence found themselves clapping, some with tears, some with the awkwardness of those not used to expressing raw feeling in public. Diane, who had watched her step for decades to keep the peace, let a small sound escape that was part relief and part pride. Kevin, the rookie, had a stunned expression that suggested he might struggle to see the world in the same way again. Gerald exhaled, a mix of fear and the knowledge that business could survive with different calculus. He stepped forward to speak with Mrs. Wei, to smooth the immediate edges, and to begin the damage control procedures managers learned to recite by rote. For once his priorities were not purely profit. He had witnessed dignity refused, and the public response that made profit secondary to human consequences. Maya waited while the ripples found edges. She did not gloat. Her voice, when she spoke again, was small enough to be private, and large enough to be heard. She thanked Mrs. Wei, not for rescue but for recognition. Her eyes searched for Josephine in the crowd of images forming in her head. The old woman's smile when she remembered a name, the brief coma of recognition on good mornings, the clean scent of detergent on her sheets. She thought of the nights when she had whispered stories to keep the old woman calm, stories that had once been told in Mandarin at a diplomatic table and now found their way back as lullabies. By the time the manager and Mrs. Wei concluded their conversation, the public had already taken a seat in the narrative. Bloggers posted stills. A feed of comments grew like a tide. Some expressed outrage on Maya's behalf. Others debated the ethics of public shaming and the risk of false allegations. That debate, messy and human, only pressed the story further into the light. 2 nights later, the consequences began to arrive with the slow cruelty of officialdom. Mrs. Wei's spokesperson issued a statement. She would pause further investment with TechFear pending an internal review of the allegations. Her office would commission independent auditors to examine claims of misreported emissions. They used the careful language of financial caution. Allegations, internal review, independent audit. But the effect on Richard's standing was stark. Where money had once been able to mute scrutiny, the sound of it now invited exacting attention. Richard issued his own brief statement denying wrongdoing, calling for calm and cooperation with any review. Corporate spokespeople are trained for this liturgy. Deny, assert confidence, call for time. But in the court of immediate public opinion, time often looks like guilt. Investors, nervous by nature, began to ask questions that had been whispered in corridors and at off-site retreats. The sort of scrutiny that had once been theoretical now approached like a weather front. Maya did not become famous overnight. She continued to work the night shifts for a brief while, her tips supplemented by words of gratitude and job offers that arrived in small, tangible increments. A magazine photographer asking for a portrait, a former colleague from her translation days suggesting work. The offers were less important than what one woman did the day after. Mrs. Wei came back to the Celestine not as an investor in spectacle but as someone who had been seen. She met Maya in private, not for public theatrics but with the kind of earnest attention that had made her effective in the boardroom. She listened to Maya speak of Josephine, of the months when memory frayed and when choices were made to swap stability for care. Mrs. Wei offered not a quick fix, but a plan that acknowledged both need and dignity. "Would you consider working with us?" she asked. "Not as a token or a PR image, as a professional. We need people who can translate nuance, who can navigate language and context. I want someone who knows both the language and the humanity behind it." The job offer was not charity dressed as employment. It was a recognition of skill and an invitation to re-enter a world Maya had walked away from. The position came with a salary sufficient to cover Josephine's care and to return Maya to a career path where her expertise could matter without being muzzled by expectation. Mrs. Wei proposed a role that combined advisory responsibilities and liaison work for investments in environmental technology, a place where the language of diplomacy met the scrutiny of investment. It was practical and restorative. There were conditions that kept the offer credible: references, a probationary period, the usual HR checks, nothing cinematic, no sudden vaulting into wealth. The offer was a step. For Maya, it meant choices, a re-entry into a world she'd left, a renewed balance between career and caregiving, a dignity offered in place of the humiliation she had refused. What she accepted, and what she did not, was telling. She accepted the position with the understanding that her caregiving responsibilities remained paramount. She asked that the company provide support that would allow Josephine to maintain stability, a reliable caregiver, funding for medical attention, and a schedule that respected the rhythms of the woman who had raised her. Mrs. Wei agreed. The city, hungry for easy narratives, assembled its versions quickly. Some pundits turned Maya's stand into a morality play of triumph: dignity restored, villain disgraced. Others sifted through the allegations about Techfear with the clinical hunger of those who feed on corporate drama. What the story actually had been was smaller and sharper. A person who refused to be small in a room that assumed she was. A billionaire who had miscalculated the reach of humiliation. An investor whose memory of humble origins shaped a response that prioritized accountability. Not all changes were immediate or complete. Techfear's board called for a review. Some executives were reassigned. The company's stock took the kind of dip that forces new statements and press management. Legal counsel appeared on both sides, their language precise and slow. But public opinion, once engaged, had a way of opening doors broader than boardroom memos. Regulators and advocacy groups began to ask questions and share resources. Engineers who had been quiet found the courage to speak. For Maya, the most immediate and meaningful consequence was quieter than any headline. She walked into Josephine's small apartment with the care plan in her phone and a sense of unease released from her chest. Josephine sat by the window, the same shawl draped over her knees, the afternoon light making the frayed fibers glow. The old woman looked up and smiled in a way that made lines of memory intersect, a name remembered, a face placed, a hand remembered. That evening, when Maya told Josephine that she had accepted a job, the old woman's eyes shone with a clarity that was small and fierce. "You always know your words," Josephine said, voice creaky. "You use them well." Maya sat down beside her and felt something inside unclench. The future was not a sudden valley of gold. It was a rebuilding, a slow tiling of days that might now include time to breathe, to schedule appointments, to write translations again that would not only serve diplomatic press, but also stand as the honest work of a person who had been seen. In the months that followed, the Celestines incident became a case study in how small acts ripple. Training programs at some fine dining establishments began to include modules on dignity and the proper handling of customer misconduct. Investment firms incorporated stricter disclosure expectations for environmental claims. Not everything changed nationwide. Systems of power do not flip on a single evening. But the story inserted itself into the city's collective ledger as a reminder. People who have been trained to be invisible are not necessarily without capacity. Sometimes they are the ones who can read the room in ways others cannot. The viral feeds continued to churn through variations of the footage, slow-mo of Maya's steady steps, close-ups of Richard's hands tightening, Mrs. Wai's slow rise from her chair. Comment sections brimmed with empathy, debate, and cynicism in equal measure. Some voices demanded legal retribution, others cautioned against the hazards of online trials. The prudent public remembered the need for evidence. Manny's newsroom ran a piece about corporate culture and the endemic problems of reputation management. There was no simple conclusion, only ongoing consequence. Gerald found in the aftermath a new attention to how he ran his floor. He instituted clearer policies. Staff would not be required to perform acts that crossed boundaries, and customers who sought to demean would be asked to leave. It was a small bureaucratic step, but for staff who had long kept smiles as armor, it mattered. Diane kept working nights, pouring drinks and offering sagely observations to new hires. Kevin enrolled in a hospitality program, inspired by the idea that being a server did not have to mean erasing yourself. The staff kept their routines, but an undercurrent of solidarity persisted, a tacit promise that those who worked for a living would be afforded respect. For Maya, the change rippled into the smallest places. Josephine's lighter pills, the caregiver who arrived reliably 3 afternoons a week, a calendar scheduled for medical checkups with confidence rather than improvisation. Her work with Mrs. Wai's team allowed her to exercise skills she had thought left behind and to reclaim the professional identity she had once set on a shelf for love. She learned to translate not only words but ethics, helping investors and engineers find integrity where it had been eroded. Every so often she would pass the corner table at the Celestine and feel the old tension, but it had shifted. She was no longer a presence whose silence was assumed. The city still had its hierarchies. No single night undid entrenched systems. What occurred, however, was that one small act, refusing to bow, generated a set of choices and consequences that helped tilt the balance toward accountability. The most human moment for everyone involved came one late afternoon when Josephine, wearing a shawl that smelled faintly of lavender, recognized Maya after a small confusion of names. The recognition was not a cinematic cure. It was a soft, necessary mercy. They held hands and watched the light move across the apartment floor. Maya thought of language, of the strange ways words can protect and wound. She thought of dignity, how fragile it is and how fiercely people will protect what belongs to them. "What did you do?" Josephine asked, half of it curiosity and half of it the simple hunger of a person craving story. Maya smiled. And it was a smile not for the cameras but for the woman who had taught her how to stand up straight. "I told the truth," she said, "in the language both of us understand." The older woman chuckled, the sound small and real. "Good. You always had a mouth for keeping our family proud." The news feeds moved on as they always do. New scandals, new heroes, new outrages asked for their turn. But for a cohort of people, servers, investors, caretakers, family members who read the story and filed it away as something they could emulate, the image of Maya standing, refusing to kneel, remained a touchstone. When the last cameras cooled and the flurry of statements dwindled to analysis pieces, one clear refrain lingered. Dignity is not transactional. It cannot be bought or extorted with a command. It is guarded by small decisions repeated day after day. Maya did not overthrow a corporation single-handedly. She did not write policy with one speech. What she did was reassert what many are taught to forget, that human worth does not depend on a table's tip. Months later, on the anniversary of that night, a friend texted Maya a clip, a short montage of reactions, of Mrs. Wai's rise, of the city press. It was surreal, like looking at a photograph you had lived through a different way. She thought of the many people who had been underestimated, servers, caregivers, immigrants who translated between worlds without recognition. She thought of those who needed not just public apology, but practical support. The job with Mrs. Wai gave her breadth and height. The care plan gave Josephine stability. At the river near Josephine's building, the two of them sat on a bench and watched the city go by. People argued, made deals, smiled with the kind of caution that comes from experience. Josephine reached for Maya's hand and held it like something dear. "Don't let them make you small again," she said. Not as a command, but as an elder's counsel. Maya squeezed back. In the long ledger of things to be done, dignity was a line item that required tending. She had tended it that night, not for headlines, but because some things are more necessary than fear. She had spoken in a language that had once closed doors for her career and used it now to open a different one. She had chosen, in the way people choose between small comforts and lasting integrity. The city kept spinning, full of people who would sometimes fail or rise or do both. The Celestine chandeliers kept casting their light. Servers continued their quiet choreography. But somewhere in the shift, a lesson had been rehearsed and learned. Underestimating someone because of their station is a perilous calculation. Power, when wielded thoughtlessly, can be returned in the currency of exposure and accountability. And dignity, once reclaimed, is its own kind of capital. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder. Dignity can't be bought, and sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that change the world.